Hello, everybody. I'm Emma Ignaszewski, Corporate Engagement Project Manager at the Good Food Institute. Welcome to our webinar on the plant protein landscape, key ingredient sources for alternative proteins. By the end of today's session, we hope you'll have a deeper understanding of the main considerations in selecting plant protein sources for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy end products. Before we dive in, I'd like to go over a few things for housekeeping. First, we will send a copy of the presentation to all registered attendees and post the recording on GFI's YouTube channel. We will also send you a direct link to the key resource we're discussing today, which is the plant protein primer. Second, all speakers will be available to answer questions during the last 15 minutes. You will see a Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and some questions may be answered directly in the Q&A box. Today, after a brief introduction, I'll pass it over to Chris Gregson of Greenstock Food Consulting for a glance at some major plant protein profiles and a comparative look at product development, sourcing, and nutritional considerations when selecting plant protein sources. Chris will also walk us through how companies take these isolated plant ingredients and create great tasting products. We'll then hear from Kyle Gahn, GFI research analyst, who will be presenting a framework for consumer perceptions about plant proteins, given the emergence of many ingredients new to consumers. And finally, we'll open it up to some questions. And I'll note that for the Q&A, we'll also be joined by Dr. Erin Reese-Clayton, GFI Associate Director of Science and Technology. For those not yet familiar with us, the Good Food Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit that is developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We are 100% powered by philanthropy and have earned GuideStar's Platinum Seal of Transparency, an honor obtained by fewer than 1% of nonprofits. GFI has more than 100 team members around the globe. We have three key areas of focus. Our science and technology team works to advance the foundational open access research in alternative proteins, as well as create a thriving research and training ecosystem around these game-changing fields. Our corporate engagement team partners with companies and investors across the globe to drive investment, accelerate innovation, and scale the supply chain, all faster than market forces alone would allow. Our policy team advocates for fair policy and public research funding for alternative proteins. The key question we're working to address is how we will feed 10 billion people by 2050, and do so sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Industrial animal agriculture is in the top 2 to 3 most significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues. It uses 75% of agricultural land, yet provides only 33% of the global protein supply. Industrial animal agriculture is also the #1 user of medically important antibiotics. We believe an answer to these many issues is to make the meat, eggs, and dairy that people love in a more sustainable and efficient way. With alternative proteins, we can make proteins directly from plants, with fermentation technology, or by using animal cell culture. We'll be focusing on plant-based platforms for today's presentation, but it is worth noting that fermentation is increasingly being used as an enabling technology for the alt protein sector. Also, cultivated meat, aka cell-based or cultured meat, made by growing animal cells outside of the animal, has seen a lot of notable activity, including the first commercial launch in December in Singapore. The bulk of today's content is sourced from our new plant protein primer. We developed this resource to provide industry stakeholders with a framework for understanding and comparing plant protein sources and the considerations when processing plant proteins. We will send the resource to all registrants, and it is also available on the GFI website. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris Gregson of Greenstock Food Consulting to walk us through some key insights into the plant protein landscape.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be presenting for you a brief primer on perhaps the hottest topic in the food industry today, plant proteins. We'll be exploring the landscape of plant proteins, focused on their various sources and their applications in plant-based meat, dairy, and egg alternatives. There are many sources and potential future sources of plant proteins, from beans to grains, algae, and fungi. And there are currently hundreds, if not thousands, of plant protein ingredients available on the market today. So how can we navigate this world and make the right choice for our food application? It's not enough simply to find an ingredient that functions well. There are lots of other considerations, such as cost, commercial availability, regulatory approval, consumer perception, and so on. With consumer demand growing rapidly and the continuing development of many new plant protein sources, the Good Food Institute decided to create a resource that aims to consolidate information on this topic. The goal was to provide a useful overview of plant proteins, including key metrics like nutrition, functionality, and price, as well as providing a framework for thinking more generally about the topic. We'll cover some of the information in today's presentation, but if you're interested in finding out more, the full resource will be available on the Good Food Institute website. Before digging into the details, I think it's worth going over some plant protein basics. So let's start with what proteins are. All proteins are actually linear polymers. This means that they're long strings of connected monomer molecules. Each monomer in the string is one of the 20 or so amino acids that commonly occur in nature. There are millions of different types of proteins, and each one has a unique string of amino acids. Proteins differ dramatically in their size, biological function, and how they behave in foods. Each plant species has a unique combination of thousands of protein types. What we buy as an ingredient called protein is typically a complex mixture of many, many different types of protein. Plant protein sources, such as soybean or wheat, also contain non-protein components, such as starch, fiber, oils, flavors, micronutrients, and so on. And these non-protein components can have a major influence on how the ingredient behaves. So commercial protein ingredients are very complex mixtures, and their properties depend not only on the source, but also on the manufacturing process. Proteins are often extracted to adjust their properties and broaden their application window. So during extraction, the protein fraction is concentrated by removing non-protein components like lipids and carbohydrates. The details of the extraction process can influence many important parameters, including the ratio of protein types, the amount of non-protein components, the yield, the functional properties of the ingredient as a whole. Processing can also influence functionality by altering protein structure, as it can lead to various reactions such as denaturation, hydrolysis, chemical modification, cross-linking, and so on. Extracting proteins to form concentrates or isolates can be beneficial to ingredient performance. Removing oil, for example, can make it easier to texturize proteins by extrusion processing. Oil has a tendency to lubricate flow and limit the extruder's ability to add mechanical energy. Removing fiber, on the other hand, can reduce the gritty, powdery mouthfeel of some high-protein flours, which can be especially important in alternative dairy products. Extraction also enhances formulation flexibility because it gives the formulator more freedom to choose the optimum amount and type of protein and non-protein ingredients. However, extraction also poses challenges, such as maintaining the native protein structure, which is often required for optimum functionality. Also, the benefits must justify the additional cost of processing and the possible change in ingredient labeling. Protein ingredients are often expected to have useful functions in food products, such as foaming or gelation. In order to be functional, the protein usually needs to be in solution, so protein solubility is a foundational attribute. Beyond this, the functionality needed will be dependent on the food application. For example, foaming functionality may be needed for meringue, and for plant-based meat, gelling functionality is often required. Proteins have complex behavior, and their solubility and other properties depend on the environment that they're in, including chemical factors like pH and salt concentration, as well as processing conditions like shear and temperature. The chemical environment and the processing conditions are often largely fixed for a given food application, so the protein usually needs to fit the food application rather than the other way around. In the next section, we're going to show a comparison we made of some of the more common plant protein sources. To make this comparison, we evaluated the protein sources using 8 key metrics. Protein concentration is the amount of protein in the unprocessed plant material. PD-Cas is a descriptor of the protein's nutritional quality that takes into account both the digestibility of the protein and the amino acid ratio. Next, there's allergen risk, commercial production stage, flavor, and functionality. Cost was compared based on available pricing information for protein concentrates. And the final metric was global crop volume, which quantifies the total agricultural production. For a given protein source, each metric was assigned one of 5 ratings from excellent to poor and associated with a traffic light inspired color code. For example, for protein concentration, a source with greater than 30% was considered to be excellent and given a dark green color, whereas a source with less than 5% was considered to be poor and given a dark red color. We summarized 19 of the most widely available plant protein sources in this way. The aim was to enable the user to quickly scan the information and discover some of the key benefits and challenges associated with each protein source. For example, by looking at rice, we see that it's a major crop with low allergen risk and mild flavor. However, the protein concentration in the grain is rather low, and it has intermediate nutritional quality, functionality, and cost. It's important to note that many of these factors can be improved through breeding or process innovations. Indeed, a secondary goal of this chart is to highlight potential areas for ingredient innovation. Through its research grants program, GFI is taking an active role in promoting critical research to improve plant protein ingredients. For example, GFI is funding crop development projects on pea, sorghum, quinoa, and cashew apple. We conducted deeper dives into each of these 19 protein sources and created one-page summaries to capture the major points of interest in a standardized format. We're going to take a look at several of these in the next few slides. This is the one-page summary we created for soy. At the top, there's a newspaper headline that aims to succinctly summarize the protein source in just a few words. For soy, this reads, the gold standard plant protein, due to its long history, extensive development, and broad application in foods. Some of the high-level profile data from the summary table we just saw is shown on the top right. In the main body, we have sections with more in-depth information. The sourcing section tells us that soy is grown mostly in Brazil, the US, and Argentina. It tolerates poor soil, and it fixes nitrogen. And it's available in many forms, including high-protein isolates. The information on nutrition states that soy is a source of high-quality protein with possible health claim benefits. However, it's one of the top 8 allergens. The composition graphic shows that soybeans typically contain about 40% protein, the remainder split between lipids, fiber, and digestible carbohydrates. Looking at the properties, we see that soy protein has excellent functional capabilities, including gelling, emulsification, and foaming. However, lipoxygenase enzyme, if not dealt with, can yield bitter off flavors. The application section tells us that soy is used in a diverse array of food applications, including plant-based meats, egg substitutes, and non-dairy ice cream. All in all, despite having some challenges, soy is an excellent source of plant protein. Let's look at a few more. Pea is becoming a popular alternative to soy and is the fastest growing in terms of market share. The protein is extracted mostly from dry yellow peas, which can be air classified to create a protein-enriched flour. As it's not an oilseed, it's typically not hexane extracted like soy, so it's often regarded as having a cleaner process. Nutritionally, it's similar to soy, although lower in quality due to lower protein digestibility and less ideal amino acid ratio, but it also has lower allergen risk. Pea is regarded as having less functionality than soy, but can have a similar beany flavor. In fact, GFI has funded a project aimed at identifying these off flavors in pea. Nonetheless, pea has found use in a broad range of applications, including plant-based meats and dairy products. Wheat is another core source of plant protein. Its unique functionality and widespread availability contribute to its popularity. Wheat is a widely grown and traded crop, but agriculturally it suffers from many diseases and pests. A protein fraction called vital wheat gluten is obtained simply by washing starch from a wheat dough using water. Unfortunately, wheat protein's nutritional quality is rather poor, and it's considered to be a major allergen. However, its ability to form elastic doughs is unique and leads to extensive use in extrusion texturized protein. Chickpea is an abundant and familiar legume that can be used as a simple flour or as a highly functional protein, and it's a major crop in India. It's found niche application as a foaming ingredient known as aquafaba, but it can also be used in plant-based meats and dairy analogs. An almond is a consumer-friendly source of protein that can provide smooth texture and mild taste. However, like peanut, it's considered to be an allergen and aflatoxin risk, but it has potential both as a thickener and as a surface active ingredient. Corn is a major underutilized source of low allergenicity protein. The major protein called zein has very low solubility and poor nutritional value, but it's tremendously useful for coating and film formation, as well as encapsulation applications. So there's no shortage of plant protein sources. We don't have time to cover them in this presentation, but in addition to the 19 proteins we've already talked a little bit about, the plant protein primer contains information on an additional 25 of these alternative protein sources, including red seaweeds and pongamia. One of the challenges to developing new sources is that the research and investment dollars are spread thinly over the many candidates. Their commercial viability is also dependent on many factors, including yield and the value of the co-products. On the topic of adding value, GFI is funding research projects on the interesting approach of extracting proteins from low-value agricultural side streams, such as cassava leaves. Although there are many sources of plant protein, the most widely used by far are soy and wheat, and then pea. Despite challenges with soy and wheat, their cost, functionality, and decades of development make them strong incumbents. Microprotein is a fungal protein that offers an altogether different paradigm for the creation of meat-like textures, which can be assembled from mycelial filaments, which have similarities to muscle fibers. Other proteins, such as mung bean, potato, and rice, tend to be used when their superior functionality for niche applications outweigh their higher cost. Despite the strong position of the incumbent proteins, several others, in our opinion, hold significant promise. Sunflower has the potential to be a cost-effective source of protein because of its abundance. Sunflower is the third most important oilseed. The protein is reported to have promising properties, but needs scale-up and commercial development. Mung bean is a common crop in Asia. The protein has excellent functional properties, and it's a byproduct of starch extraction. The starch is used for making noodles and other foods, but scale-up is still needed for the protein to improve cost. Potato and rice proteins are also byproducts from starch processing, and they have attractive functional attributes. As these crops have a relatively low concentration of protein, protein isn't the primary product. Therefore, protein volume can only really expand until the available precursor from starch processing is consumed. And duckweed produces a protein called rubisco, which has excellent functional properties. Duckweed is a potentially sustainable source of protein. However, it currently needs further scaling and commercial development to increase volume and decrease cost. Finally, several other crops, particularly oat, chickpea, and navy bean, have great potential if byproduct utilization can be improved. Aquatic plants can be very attractive sources of protein as well, particularly because of their minimal land and resource use. Red seaweed, like dulse, are not only a source of high-quality protein, they also contain bright red pigments called phycobiliproteins that can turn brown on cooking, and therefore may be useful colorants in plant-based meats. It's often valuable to combine proteins within a single product to achieve specific product development goals, such as cost, nutrition, or functionality. Here are 3 examples of protein combining strategies. A bricks and mortar approach is used to create burgers, sausages, and other comminuted plant-based meat products. In this approach, a texturized bulk protein like pea or wheat is combined with a heat gelling protein like potato that can act as a binder. And then there's the complementary proteins that have a synergistic effect on nutritional quality scores, such as the PDCAS value. The traditional practice of combining rice and beans falls under this category. Legumes deficient in cysteine, methionine, and tyrosine are often combined with grains deficient in lysine. As a third example, proteins can also be combined to fine-tune texture. A common example is a combination of wheat protein with soy or pea to optimize meat-like textures made by high moisture extrusion. In fact, 14 of the top 25 plant-based meat products in the US use this third strategy by combining soy and wheat protein. We've talked a lot about crops, proteins, functionality, but these materials need to be manufactured into ingredients and then used within food products, which is what we're going to talk about next. So how do manufacturers make these isolated ingredients from plants and create great tasting products? This schematic shows an overview of the processing of seeds to generate protein ingredients, as well as other co-products. The first stage is separation and cleaning, after which the seeds are milled into a flour. Seeds tend to be high in either oil or starch, and they all contain significant amounts of fiber. These components are removed through various extraction processes. With oil seeds, like soy, the extracted oil is usually the primary product. In some cases, like rice or corn, it's the carbohydrate fraction, particularly the starch, that's the primary product. Depending on the concentration of protein in the protein-rich fraction, the extract will be classified as either a concentrate or an isolate. These can be used as is within food products or further processed, for example, by extrusion, texturizing, or hydrolysis. GFI is funding research projects in plant protein processing, including the exploration of functional fractions, integrating sensors into extruders, shear cell technology, microstructure engineering, as well as novel ways of creating fiber and muscle structures. Next, we're going to explore how proteins are used in plant-based food applications and some areas of opportunity for innovation. For plant-based meat and fish, the typical process involves mixing extrusion texturized proteins with fat, binders, colors, and flavorings, and then forming the mass into the desired shape. Often the product is pre-cooked prior to packing and cold storage. There's a huge amount of opportunity for further development in this area, such as going beyond the usual comminuted meat products like burgers, sausages, and nuggets, and developing whole muscle cuts and seafood products. Flavors can be improved by reducing off flavors in the base plant protein ingredients, such as by limiting lipoxygenase activity through plant breeding or inactivating the enzyme through processing. Flavors are typically added to create the taste of pork, beef, chicken, and so on. A current trend is to supplement added flavors by incorporating flavor precursors that form flavors in situ during cooking, like they do in animal meat. Another area of opportunity is further improving the nutritional benefits of plant-based meats versus animal-based meats. One example of this is the development of structured oils for saturated fat reduction, towards which there are also GFI-funded projects underway. Nutritional improvements can also be made through crop development, such as a recently developed soybean varietal claimed to have better digestibility, heart-healthy fatty acids, and ultra-high protein content. Next, let's look briefly at plant-based milks. These are produced by blending a protein ingredient with water, often with the addition of other ingredients like nutrients and sweeteners. Despite the success of plant-based milks, there are still opportunities for further development, including cost reduction, flavor parity, and the improvement of mouthfeel. Plant-based yogurts go through a similar process, but with the addition of texturizers to create a spoonable texture, as well as a fermentation step. The opportunities are also similar and include texture improvement and clean label stabilization. There are two main types of plant-based cheese, nut-based and texturized emulsions. Opportunities in this space include improved nutrition, development of greater diversity of cheese types, as well as enhancing melting, browning, and grating performance. Finally, plant-based eggs. Solutions have been developed to replace many of the functions of hen eggs. These include liquid egg scramble products, glazing agents, and ingredients to replace eggs in bakery applications. Opportunities in this area include improved one-size-fits-all products, as well as application-optimized solutions. So, as a conclusion to this section of the presentation, there are several key takeaways. Commercial proteins should really be thought of as complex mixtures of proteins and non-protein components. The properties of commercial protein products depend on both the plant source and the manufacturing process. And the process influences things like the protein concentration, which fractions are extracted, as well as the structure of the protein itself. There are many potential sources of novel plant proteins. Wheat and soy remain the leaders, but pea is rapidly growing. Commercial viability of a new protein source often requires value to be generated from both the protein and the non-protein components, such as oil or starch. And when choosing a plant protein ingredient, the optimal choice is dependent on numerous factors, including functionality, cost, consumer perception, and so on. In addition, formulations often benefit from synergies between proteins. Finally, I'd like to finish by saying that huge opportunities remain for innovation and business development in this exciting area of food technology. So next, we're going to hear about consumer preferences from Kyle Garn, who is a research analyst at the Good Food Institute.
Great, thank you, Chris. To start, let's review some high-level consumer perceptions about plant-based proteins. This first slide will be a quick slide with one takeaway, mainly that a majority of consumers, at 76%, believe plant-based proteins are healthy, versus only 2% that do not think they are healthy. Everyone has likely been told at some point to eat their vegetables because of the positive health benefits. And this graph suggests that most people have internalized that message and recognize that plant proteins are healthy. The last graph was from 2017, so let's look at some more recent data. This graph is from the International Food Information Council. It displays data from December 2019. Respondents were asked to compare the environmental impact of producing plant alternatives to meat versus traditional animal-based meat products. 47% of respondents indicated they felt plant-based meat products are better for the environment, while only 5% of respondents felt plant-based meat is worse for the environment. It's worth noting that the way this question was designed, 24% of respondents indicated they were not sure how they felt about the question. So if we take those respondents out of the analysis, then 63% of those who had an opinion on the issue feel that plant-based meat products are better for the environment than animal-based meat products. This is a positive sign for plant-based meat products, but it also highlights that educating consumers about the environmental benefits of plant-based meat is necessary to capture that 24% of respondents who weren't sure how to answer the question. This graph is from another International Food Information Council study released in May 2020. It asked respondents to compare plant-based burgers to animal-based burgers, specifically, which is healthier. 41% of respondents think plant-based burgers are healthier versus 31% of respondents that think animal-based burgers are healthier. While a larger percentage of consumers think plant-based burgers are healthier, the percentage of people who favor animal-based meat over plant-based meat is higher than the results in the prior graph. This is another example of the need to better educate consumers about the various benefits of plant-based meat and plant-based proteins, particularly in comparison to animal-based proteins. A common question we receive is around consumer perceptions of soy. To start, I want to highlight that both the American Cancer Society and the American Institute for Cancer Research have indicated that there are no dangers from eating soy, and that the health benefits of soy appear to outweigh any potential of perceived risks. So it's not so much a question of, is soy healthy, as it is to consumers recognize that it is. This graph displays findings from annual surveys asking if consumers view soy as healthy. You can see that a consistent majority of consumers do view soy as healthy. However, these surveys are from the United Soybean Board. So for a second opinion, I've also brought in a data point from a recent Mintel report. The Mintel report asked the question in the inverse way, specifically if consumers felt soy is unhealthy. In this case, only 18% of respondents indicated that they feel soy is unhealthy, which is roughly in line with the data I've presented already. A key question for many plant-based companies is, what plant proteins do consumers prefer in their plant-based food products? Consumer research surveys poke at this question, but it's important to keep in mind that consumer preferences are likely heavily influenced by their familiarity with protein sources. This graph is an example of this dynamic. The question specifically asks which plant-based proteins consumers prefer as the base for plant-based meat products. We can see that more common sources such as pea and soy are actually low on the list, and that consumers are more interested in chickpea and lentils as a protein base. But before every plant-based company starts trying to reformulate their products to lentil or garbanzo beans, note how the top preferred plant source is other beans. This is interesting because in consumer surveys, respondents are generally given answers that are more common or expected, and the other category is used as a catch-all option to capture less common responses. But in this case, the other category is the most chosen of the various options. What this suggests to me is that consumers are choosing other beans because commonly eaten beans like black beans, pinto beans, or kidney beans were not offered as answers. In other words, respondents are looking for the beans they recognize and consume most frequently, because when asked what they would want to make up their plant-based meat product, they're choosing what they're most familiar with and eat already. We see another example of this dynamic on this graph. Here, consumers are asked which types of plant-based proteins they eat. 80% of respondents indicated they eat rice-based and potato-based proteins, far more than those who say they eat pea or soy-based proteins. This is an interesting finding because by and large, not many plant-based food items are rice-based or potato-based, particularly back in 2017 when this question was asked. For example, rice-based milks do exist, but they are a very tiny segment of the plant-based milk category and are dwarfed in sales by almond and soy milk. Similarly, there are products like Beyond Burger that use potato starch, but those aren't the primary proteins in the product. So while I can't say this with certainty, what is likely happening is that respondents read this question and went, oh, I eat rice and potatoes, so I should check these options. So rather than the question identifying which types of plant-based proteins make up the plant-based products people eat the most, it's likely the case it's actually just identifying what types of plants people generally eat. Keeping those prior slides in mind, let's look at actual sales of plant-based products. This slide displays plant-based meat dollar sales and dollar sales growth by analog and non-analog plant-based meat products. Analog products are plant-based meat products that closely resemble animal-based meat. They are generally made from soy or pea. Non-analog plant-based products refer to veggie burger style products that use more commonly eaten vegetables like black beans. As we can see here, the soy and pea-based products make up the majority of category sales and are driving category growth, whereas the non-analog products are experiencing decreasing growth. So while consumers might say in surveys that they prefer pea and soy less, we can see from their buying behavior that in practice, they actually heavily consume these products at the expense of more plant-forward black bean style burgers. This slide presents another example of consumer preferences and studies not aligning with their actual behavior. A GFI study in partnership with MindLab that was conducted in 2019 found that plant-based dairy products that emphasize ingredients like oat performed poorly in consumer surveys mainly because oat was considered an unusual ingredient at the time. The left-hand side of the slide displays the findings from that survey. However, on the right-hand side of the slide, I've displayed sales data of milk sales from less than a year after the study was conducted. We can see that oat milk has skyrocketing sales compared to the prior year, far higher than both plant-based milk and animal-based milk as total categories. In other words, consumer preferences and behavior shifted rapidly as oat milk became a more common product. Consumers realized the quality that the product provided. I covered these slides mainly because I want to highlight that brands should consider factors like ingredient availability and functionality alongside consumer preferences. If we only consider consumer preference, then potentially powerful novel proteins that can heavily improve product taste and performance might never be used simply because consumers don't recognize it. Most consumers have never heard of duckweed or pongamia, but such novel ingredients may be able to create better plant-based products that consumers will love. Thus, brands should keep consumer preferences in mind, but remember that the introduction of a plant-based product that is tasty and priced well can rapidly change consumer behavior, even if it's made from protein sources consumers might not prioritize in surveys prior to the release of that product. With that, I would now like to hand things back to Emma, who will be moderating the Q&A for this webinar.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Chris. That concludes the presentation portion of the webinar, and we'll move on to our Q&A session. I also will reiterate that we will be sending all registrants a direct link to the plant protein primer, as well as our deck we presented today. A recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel as well. I also welcome you to sign up for GFI's Plant-Based Insider newsletter to receive monthly updates on the alt protein industry, as well as new resources. And at this point, we'd love to take a few questions. Please add any you have to the Q&A box. I'll extend our first question to Aaron. We detailed throughout the presentation a number of research projects towards plant protein processing funded by GFI's research grant program. Aaron, how do researchers acquire this funding, and what are the types of projects you're looking for?
Thanks, Emma. I will drop a link in the chat to our research grants program webpage. That's where people can go to find details about funding opportunities, learn more about the research that GFI has already funded, and see additional research initiatives that we're involved in. GFI's research program is now in its third year, and to date, thanks to our philanthropic donors, we've funded over $7 million of open access research in 13 countries across the world. Our program really exists to develop the scientific foundation of the alternative protein industry. We see ourselves as seeding the science of this industry. And we focus on funding plant-based and cultivated meat research that addresses the scientific barriers to improve sensory characteristics, cost, and scale up of these products. And the research that we fund is open access. We do fund projects from universities as well as government scientists and private companies. We are currently accepting proposals for our annual competitive research grant program, and we'll be accepting proposals for that RFP through March 10th. This year, we are specifically requesting projects that focus on addressing the scientific and technical bottlenecks facing the production of whole muscle cut, plant-based and cultivated meat and seafood. We also accept proposals year-round to our exploratory grants mechanism. Again, I encourage everyone to visit the website for more information and the detailed RFPs. And you can also reach out directly to our grants management team at the email address that I will drop in the chat.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erin. I hope we get a lot of applications for grant funding from this group. Our next question is going to go to Chris. There are a lot of questions about our methodology for the plant protein primer. Could you speak to a little bit on the sort of types of sources you used in compiling this information, as well as comment on the extent to which the data in this resource refers to protein isolates versus concentrates versus flours? Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Finding reliable data on plant proteins is quite challenging at times. And so in developing this, this database, we scoured all sorts of different sources. So for example, for global crop volume, we looked at the FAO database. So we got very reliable figures for the the volume of crops produced globally. Where possible, we use primary sources. So we scoured the academic literature for information on the properties of proteins and protein extracts and so on. Cost information, I actually found the most reliable information was actually from Alibaba. Because cost information is not widely available at all. So that was very challenging to get. And then there was another set of information that was already available within GFI databases as well. So it was a broad selection of data sources, and wherever possible, primary sources were used. On the question about whether the data refers to concentrates or isolates, well, the cost information was always based on concentrates to make it a sort of a level playing field wherever possible. And then the information was based on the protein as a whole. So it was really the flour or the concentrate, not so much the isolate, but trying to take into consideration the properties of the product as a whole, focusing on the least sort of processed material. So it wasn't based on modified proteins, for example. So so the data wasn't based on protein hydrosylates or cross-linked proteins. It was based on the original protein source, as would be sort of extracted from a using ordinary methods.
Excellent, thank you, Chris. This next question goes to Kyle. Kyle, how do consumer perceptions about specific plant protein sources compare to other barriers to adoption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we look at data on consumer motivations, in a lot of cases, consumers say health is the primary reason that they're interested in plant-based proteins or plant-based foods generally. But interestingly, when we ask consumers what stops them from eating plant-based proteins or why they might not continue, taste is oftentimes the most common cited response. So in a similar way, like when we consider perceptions of plant proteins, factors like taste are arguably more important for consumers because that's what they're experiencing when they're directly eating the product. And that's arguably the largest factor in determining whether they come back or continue eating that product. So if we compare perceptions of the plant proteins that are being used in products versus other factors, I would at least suggest that brands and companies prioritize using those plant proteins that create better taste, rather than trying to think about which plant proteins consumers would want to see. Because at the end of the day, their decisions are driven by whether or not they liked the taste of the food that they're eating. Emma, would you say that sufficiently answers the question?
Yes, thank you, Kyle. This next question goes to Chris. What are the most common protein extraction methods currently used? Chris?
Yeah, so there's quite a number of different protein extraction methods. So one is dry milling and then density fractionation to create higher protein concentrates from flours. And then there's methods that are based on solubilizing the proteins and then removing them from solution in some way. So isoelectric point precipitation is one of those methods. Solvent precipitation is another. And then more recently, a lot of interest has been placed on microfiltration to remove the protein from solution. So that's an interesting approach that is that can be beneficial when you want to keep the protein in its native form and undenatured. So yeah, so there's quite a few methods.
Excellent, thanks, Chris. This next question is for Aaron. So we're seeing a lot of questions about the relative environmental impacts of different plant protein sources in the Q&A. And I'm wondering, Aaron, if you could comment on how plant protein sources fare overall in environmental impacts compared to conventional meat.
Sure. So we know that fundamentally eating plants is more efficient than growing plants to feed animals and eating those animals. Even after we account for the processing steps that are required to turn plants into plant-based meat, the studies that do exist they all find that replacing conventional meat with plant-based meat reduces every environmental impact measured. So these studies estimate that plant-based meat uses somewhere between 47 to 99% less land than conventional meat. Plant-based meat emits 30 to 90% less greenhouse gas than conventional meat, uses 72 to 99% less water. So there's the data that does exist pretty strongly supports environmental benefits. I think it's still a little bit of an open question in terms of comparing specific plant protein sources. But we know that, pulses tend to require less fertilizer and have some environmental advantages compared to cereal crops. So I think that this is still an area that is worth exploring, but there's strong reason to believe that we're going to see environmental benefits and continue to see improvements in these environmental benefits from plant sources of food.
Thank you, Aaron. I think that helps contextualize the larger problem that all of these plant protein sources are sort of offering extreme benefits to solve. Next question is for Chris. Chris, are all current texturizing methods extrusion-based? We had a few questions about extrusion. In the early days of alternative meat development, soy protein spinning attracted a lot of attention. Has that fallen out of favor? And if so, why? Someone also asked about shear cell technology compared to extrusion.
Yeah, so this is a really great question. So I'm really glad you brought up protein spinning, because really the first Western approach of creating texturized proteins was done through fiber spinning, and this is a technology that was actually developed initially by Ford Motor Company of all places, and then was commercialized by General Foods. So yes, that's I'm trying to get to the bottom of this question. I think it's a really interesting question. I think what happened was just the capital expense of the spinning process was just far more expensive than low moisture extrusion technology, which was invented at around 1970 or so. So I think that just the cost part was the reason for sort of the demise really of fiber spinning. But yeah, there are other ways of creating texture within proteins, of course, and shear cell technology is a technology that's been worked on at Wageningen University in the Netherlands for quite some years. I think maybe more than a decade, and it can produce products which have very interesting multi-scale textural properties. So that's an interesting technology if it can be scaled effectively, like extrusion has. High moisture extrusion is becoming increasingly popular as a way of creating much more meat-like textures. So that's similar to low moisture extrusion, except it uses more water and has got a cooling die following the usual extrusion element. And then there's a bunch of other ways of adding texture that have been evaluated over the years and are used in certain circumstances. So for example, transglutaminase enzyme is used to gel proteins at times, and that can be useful. There are various ways of creating fibers, such as electrospinning, which have had some attention over the years. There's a lot of interest in 3D printing right now, and that might be interesting if the scalability problems with 3D printing can be solved. And then there's, of course, the traditional methods that have been developed in Asia, predominantly, China, Japan, and so on, such as the creation of skins of proteins. So there's a product called tofu, which is a really interesting texturized protein, which really hasn't been utilized enough, in my opinion, in Western style food products.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. Next question is for Kyle. Kyle, would it be accurate to say that consumers are looking for novelty in the format of their potential plant-based food purchases, but familiarity in the ingredients used?
I think the answer depends on how you define novelty. If novelty is in new examples of plant-based meat products that are now matching animal-based meat products that we normally haven't seen plant-based versions of. So for example, like a plant-based steak or a plant-based chicken breast, I could see that as being a novel format that people would be interested in. But that's because of the familiarity with existing animal-based meat products. So the Plant-Based Foods Association and Kroger did a study last year where they found that by merchandising plant-based meat in the animal-based meat section actually increased sales. And so I think that speaks to the idea that people want a degree of familiarity with the product. So they want a plant-based meat product that resembles an animal-based meat product and is sold in the same location and creates that level of comfort with them. So the second part of the question about familiarity with the ingredients used, I just want to note back to those graphs that I showed earlier, where in most cases people say that they want certain ingredients, but when you look at their actual behavior, it doesn't actually seem to matter to them. And I think the majority of consumers aren't really going line by line on the ingredient list and aren't really looking deeper beyond what the initial product packaging says. There's actually the study that I have pulled up right now that they surveyed consumers, and 50% of consumers admitted that they didn't know how much protein they consumed in the past 24 hours. And 40% admitted that they didn't even know why they needed protein in their body. So, I think the majority of consumers aren't looking deeply enough into the ingredients list for that question to be driving their actual purchasing behavior and decisions. So to summarize, I do think familiarity is important in like the product format and how it's sold, but I don't think most consumers are looking at the ingredients in heavy detail.
Thanks, Kyle. Next question goes to you, Aaron. Aaron, can you comment on specific crop varieties with desirable protein profiles? Have these been bred specifically for use as plant protein?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and one where I think there's a lot of white space to be addressed. One of the challenges that plant-based manufacturers face is that the crops that we're using have typically been optimized for oil or starch production. And so I think we're just now starting to see more effort put into breeding plants as raw materials for protein sources. And I think that's going to lead to benefits in all of the downstream steps towards producing plant-based foods when we have starting materials that have been optimized. So GFI is funding some projects to specifically develop varieties of pea and quinoa and other crops to be used as protein sources. We're seeing some companies like Benson Hill who have released a new variety of soy, which has a higher protein content. So they've developed this particularly as a plant-based protein source. And I think there's a lot more research and work that can be done to optimize crops for plant-based protein foods.
Thank you, Erin. And I think we'll have time for, we'll probably sneak in one more question before we close. And this last question is for you, Chris. Can mycoprotein be blended with plant proteins in a usable way?
Yeah, I think the answer is definitely yes. Mycoprotein is great at creating the microfibrils that emulate the muscle fiber structure, but you're still left with essentially a slurry of fibers, and you need to be able to form that into a cohesive structure to make your chicken nugget type, and that's often done using animal protein. So egg albumin, for example, is sometimes used to essentially glue those fibers together. So plant proteins provide an alternative to that sort of secondary structuring protein. So something like a potato protein will be an excellent choice as a heat gelling protein that could bind those mycoprotein fibers together and create a chicken nugget or a burger or something like that.
Awesome, thank you, Chris. And everyone, I'm sorry we didn't get to have the time to get to all of these insightful questions in the Q&A box. Some really great ones in there, but please feel free to reach out to us at corporate@gfi.org with any questions we didn't get to in our limited time. To learn more, feel free to contact us, and please check out our wealth of resources on gfi.org. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.